Hi, welcome everyone. Yes, my name's Sarah. I'm Team Wilder Community Engagement Officer and Volunteer Coordinator at present, although I am becoming our Conservation Project Officer at the end of this month, so lots of job titles to remember. Just let people come in. So I'm going to give us a quick talk on what a wilder Herefordshire for people and nature might look like and what we can all do to help achieve that. So I'm going to start by very quickly giving us a bit of background on the biodiversity and climate crisis. In 2019, there was a State of Nature report released, which showed the state of the UK's wildlife. And it painted quite a stark picture. One of the measures they use is Biodiversity Intactness Index, which looks at the amount of biodiversity in the country and how it has declined over time. And we ranked 189th out of 218 countries, so it's not a particularly pretty picture for us. Since the 1970s, there's been a dramatic decline in wildlife abundance across the country, and there's a number of drivers for this change. Things like agricultural management, the way we manage our woodlands and our fresh water, increasing urbanisation and the pollution that comes with that. But increasingly over the last few years, we've started to see the impacts of climate change as a huge driver for change in our wildlife communities. And some of the statistics that are coming out are showing the change in wildlife populations that is due specifically to climate change factors. So 48% of moth decline can be attributed specifically to climate change, and 60% of aphid increase is due to climate change. And other species are seeing changes in their behavioural patterns. So migratory birds are arriving earlier, and they're also often breeding earlier as well. And the reason this causes problems is we start to see mismatches in the timings of different species. So they might be breeding at a time that is less than optimal in terms of temperature or food source for their young. And so we're starting to see impacts on species due to these mismatches. And we need to have a think about how nature can help us tackle climate change. And so we've probably all heard of the benefits of planting trees and the way trees can sequester carbon, but trees aren't the only source that can sequester carbon for us. So wetland is a fantastic carbon store, as is grassland. If you've got a pond in your garden, then that is storing carbon for you as well. So it's all about looking at our landscapes and working out how they can work with us to help to store some of the carbon that's in the atmosphere. Natural landscapes can also help with natural cooling. So in an urban area or even a village like this where you've got lots of buildings together, you've probably, if you've ever walked along on a really hot day, felt the heat that comes off those buildings. Having more green spaces and more greenery in our urban areas can actually help to decrease the temperatures, hopefully helping to maintain lower temperatures over the long term. So we can see that climate change is having an impact on nature, but nature can also help us in our fight against climate change. And we want to make sure that Herefordshire is thriving for wildlife so that it can optimise our chances of its survival over the long term. So what we'd like to see is a Herefordshire which is thriving for nature. And this means making space for nature, not just in specific areas, so not just on our nature reserves, but also throughout our farmland and throughout our urban areas. It shouldn't be that nature happens somewhere else. It should be part of our everyday lives, and it needs to be part of our rural and urban landscapes because we can't survive without the benefits of wildlife. We need healthy natural rivers and floodplains because they can help us reduce our water bills where it costs water companies less to clean the waters that we drink. It can help to reduce the impacts of flooding on us, and they can be a really great source of habitats for different wildlife. We need to identify things that maybe we don't necessarily associate as being good for wildlife, so things like road verges and village greens, and make sure that they are also thriving for wildlife. That they're not just places that sort of get forgotten about. And we want to make sure that everyone can access those wild spaces. So there should be wild spaces within 10 minutes of everyone's home. when we live in a rural area, we often think we're quite lucky and it's easy to access it, but sometimes there can be barriers to people being able to access those green spaces, which might be to do with accessibility, might be to do with knowledge of where those spaces are. So it's making sure that everyone can benefit from wild spaces. One of the important things that we need to look at is how we can connect different areas that are thriving for wildlife and make sure that they don't become isolated. If an area becomes isolated, it can really impact on the species that live there. They might not be able to find food sources if a particular food source fails one year. They may suffer from a lack of genetic diversity, which means that over time the species may eventually decline and become extinct. And so we need to create these nature recovery networks. It's about creating spaces that are more, bigger, better and better connected, which is that phrase there. So like I said, issues with isolated populations or these islands, which is what nature reserves, wildlife-friendly gardens, particular farmers who are very keen on encouraging wildlife. You can start to get these areas that are surrounded by more barren landscapes, whether that's an urban landscape or whether that's, for example, an intensive agricultural landscape that doesn't have any wildlife. And we need to make sure that we connect these areas that are good for wildlife together. And corridors are really important because they allow species to move between different habitats. And it's really important for small wildlife. So some of our smallest wildlife can actually travel quite big distances. Toads, for example, will travel up to 5 kilometres from their breeding ponds, and hedgehogs can travel 2 kilometres a night. So that's why it's so vital that we have these healthy corridors so that species aren't becoming stuck in specific areas. We also want to create a Herefordshire that is thriving for people. We all know that there are benefits to wildlife for us, but we really want to extend that so that everyone can experience those benefits. And one of those that I mentioned earlier was the natural flood management. And this isn't just about using natural spaces for natural flood management, but for other ways that it can help us. So I was mentioning that it can help to sequester carbon, which means we can use our landscapes to help us to tackle climate change. Natural flood management can allow us to slow the flow of water so that less water reaches the rivers and we suffer flooding less in our urban areas. Wildlife can be really good for our health and well-being. It can bring benefits to everyone's mental and physical well-being through increased activity, reduced pollution levels. It can reduce stress and anxiety, and this through social prescribing, which is becoming a much bigger area that the NHS is looking at, can help to reduce the demand on the NHS for some of its services, which can be really beneficial to every community. Wildlife can also help us to increase our sense of community. In Colwall, you're really lucky with the Colwall Orchard Group and some of the other community projects that happen. And this can be really important for people who are experiencing isolation. It can bring people together and share their ideas and start to make a difference in their local areas. So what's already happening in Herefordshire? Herefordshire is a really lucky county in that we've got lots of rural areas, and we've also got lots of people who want to make a change. There's already loads going on in the county. We have lots of citizen scientists out there monitoring the health of our rivers, which we know are in a poor state of health. So this monitoring is really valuable, not just to us, but to the government as well. When we're writing reports and things, we can pull more data than we'd be able to access without these citizen scientists doing their monitoring. There are roadside verge nature reserves. So if anyone's heard of Verging on Wild, they're a group who go out and make sure that our roadside verges are abundant with wildlife and pollinator-friendly plants, lots of different wildflowers, and making sure that they're not cut too early in the season so that they can provide as much benefit to wildlife as they possibly can. Parish councils and community groups are starting to take on more areas of land and to manage them in a way that's beneficial not just to wildlife but to the communities as well, creating educational spaces, increasing woodland and creating forest schools areas within woodlands, improving wetlands, and managing all of these different areas in a way that's beneficial for wildlife. Churches and schools also starting to manage their land more for wildlife. Caring for God's Acre is something that a lot of churches have joined. This has been increased to eco churches as well, which is another scheme that churches can sign up to, which encourages them to change some of their practices or increase the amount of habitat in churchyards for wildlife. And many schools are creating more areas that are slightly wilder in their schoolyards. Things like bug hotels create great habitats for insects within school areas and don't take up too much space. They're also a great educational tool for the children. And gardens. In the UK, gardens cover an area of more than 50 million acres, more than all of the nature reserves in the country put together. So our gardens are a really important resource for wildlife. And if we manage them in a way that is more attractive to wildlife, we can really help to increase some of the populations which are declining the steepest. So a lot of our pollinators, which are obviously really valuable for continuing to produce food, can really benefit from a healthy garden. Things like wildlife ponds, messy areas with piles of logs, brambles, can all be ways of helping to encourage more wildlife to your gardens. I mentioned the citizen scientists who are monitoring the rivers, but there's plenty of other citizen science projects going on across the county as well. So Friends of the Upper Wye are one of the groups that are monitoring the River Wye, but there's other projects like the Big Butterfly Count, Hedgehog Street, Discovering Reptiles, Garden Wildlife Health, and the Big Garden Bird Watch. These are all ways that we can help to contribute to the national picture of wildlife across the UK, which is really important so that we can help to identify areas where wildlife is doing well and where it's struggling, so that we can map out those nature recovery networks that I mentioned, and make sure that we're targeting the right habitats in the right areas. If we don't know what's there, we don't know what we're going to help or what we might be damaging by changing a habitat. So it's really important that we have as much data as possible. So if you do have wildlife in your garden, or you like to go for walks and you see wildlife, you don't need to be an expert to contribute to citizen scientist projects. Many of these, for example, hedgehogs, you're just going on and recording where you saw a hedgehog, whether it was dead or alive, and that it was in fact a hedgehog. Big Garden Bird Watch, they produce excellent sheets that you can use to identify the birds in your garden. And that's particularly helpful because birds on bird feeders stay still a bit longer than birds in trees. And some of the other sites, so I mentioned on this one, iRecord, which is a site that you can use to record any wildlife that you see. And if you do record something and you're not 100% certain what it is, if you include a picture, then an expert will go on there and verify for you exactly what that species is. Another way of helping wildlife is to join a campaign. At the moment, there's quite a lot of rivers campaigns going on. Writing to your MP or signing up to some petitions run by different environmental charities can help to change policies in government and help to protect our landscapes more and more. It's particularly relevant at the moment. You may have seen our Defend Nature campaign, which we're working on along with the RSPB, National Trust and other environmental charities, which is about making sure that our habitats are protected going forward. There's been quite a lot of talk in the government lately about removing some of the protections to different habitats. One that's very relevant for you at the moment, a project that we've got started recently, is the 7 Treescapes project. It's a partnership project with Worcestershire and Gloucestershire Wildlife Trusts. One of my colleagues, Mandy from Gloucestershire, is with me on a stool today. The project's about increasing tree cover from the Forest of Dean in the south right the way up to the Wyre Forest in the north. It's not about creating solid tree cover between the two, just increasing where the tree cover is and how it's connected as well. So this is the project area. You can see this is right down in the south, in the Forest of Dean. Hereford's over here, Gloucestershire's here, we're around here, and then going right the way up to Kidderminster in the north. And so the project is funded by a number of sources, and it's about working with landowners, whether they are farmers, whether they're just landowners, whether they're parish councils or community groups or schools, to increase the amount of trees that they're planting in their area, in places that are right for tree planting. I mentioned earlier the right tree, right place. We don't want to remove other valuable habitats or valuable farmland. It's just about identifying areas where we can plant more trees to increase the amount of tree cover. And in some cases, that may be hedgerows rather than actual woodland. So if you're interested in the 7 Treescapes project, do come and have a chat with Mandy. She's very interested in making connections with people and having a chat to anyone who's interested. And that was a whistle-stop tour of wilder Herefordshire. Thank you very much.
Thank you.